Hey guys, it's COREROSS and welcome to Busting Rainbow Six Siege. Today we are myth-busting Mute, who is receiving a rather simple change to his gadget. However, it turns out it's not so simple and it's really quite interesting. So first of all, the basics of the change. Right now, before the launch of the new season, Operation Tenfold Pursuit, Mute Jammers creates an EMP effect on gadgets. And this means everything electrical that gets into their radius, whether it's an attacker gadget or let's say Brava has hacked the jammer, then it's every defender electronic gadget is fully disabled when it is inside the radius of a mute jammer. But it also affects players with negative and positive effects. So for instance, an attacker standing in a mute jammer cannot control their electronic gadgets. But a defender standing in a mute jammer, for instance, cannot be scanned by Lion. And I would say for the most part, this is a easy enough system to understand to the point of where if you were to bring a new player in and you simply said to them, that mute jammer stops all enemy electronics within its radius, then you've essentially explained 99% of what that mute jammer does. But that is all changing as mute jammers are now going to jam all signals, which I gotta say does match well with the gadget's name. However, as we're about to see, it's kind of a bit more complicated than it previously was, and if you were now to tell a brand new player what a mute jammer does, I think it's going to be a little bit longer of an explanation now, to the point of where you'll probably just confuse them, even though the baseline idea is pretty simple. Anyway, let's get into the testing and busting of myths, and I think we do have some proper myths here. And we'll start with a couple of hard ones that you're probably going to get wrong. Myth number 1 is that the new version of Mute Jammer counters Nuke. And believe it or not, this is actually correct, as walking into a Mute Jammer's radius switches off Nuke's ability and jams it from being switched on. Now at first you might be confused by this because the new jammers are supposed to just jam now, they're not supposed to have an EMP effect anymore. However, Nuke's ability, which is a gadget on her back, hacks into the camera systems and removes her in real time from the video feeds, so edits her out. And of course, it needs to connect to the camera system to do that. So the mute jammer is actually correct here, and believe it or not, it is certainly confirmed that Mute now counters Nuke if she walks into the radius. The next myth is a juicy one, and it is that Mute jammers counter Blitz's flash shield. This has always been one of contention in the community because it does counter it right now. However, there's no wireless signals being sent out as Blitz is pressing a button that is wired into the shield. And as you can see, the new version of Mute's jammer no longer counters Blitz's flash shield. So that is now busted. Now let's myth bust some hard breachers against the new Mute jammer. We'll begin first with Hibana, and I think you can guess where this is going to go. So her pellets need to be detonated via a signal sent from her gadget, which is stopped by the jammer, and this confirms that he still counters Hibana. But does Mute counter Ace? Of course, Ace's gadget does not require any kind of signal to detonate it, so as a result, it will go off with no problem now. That means it's now busted. Now this myth is not going to surprise anyone because it was in the actual reveal for this season, and it's the fact that Mute no longer counters secondary hard breaches. And this makes perfect sense as the secondary hard breach is activated by pulling a pin, so there's no signal being sent. And this is easily the biggest nerf to Mute because it essentially means you can never use him as a counter to any hard breachers because the chances of at least one person on the enemy team having a secondary hard breach to just get around your Mute jammers is quite high. But what about Thermite? This should be a pretty clean-cut myth because of course we got to put the charge down and then send a signal to detonate it, as you can see here. So certainly that's confirmed. We do counter Thermite charges. However, if this is a wall that Thermite can repel on, he can put the charge above the signal jammer's range. And even though that range has been increased, it's not been increased enough to actually cover the entire reinforced wall. So you can actually just place it above the mute jammer's range and then set it off, and you get exactly the same hole and you have bypassed the mute jammer. So actually it's busted if it's a wall that you can repel on. Now let's do some quick fire myths. So Mute used to counter claymores, but as there is no signal to jam, he no longer counters them. So that is busted. Mute also used to counter nomad charges if they were in the range of the jammer, but that is no longer the case. So that's another one that is busted. However, Mute counters Yana as her holograms need to communicate with her and send signals, so this is actually confirmed. Mute counters Fuse, so of course you need to send a signal to the cluster charge to set it off, and Mute jammers stop it. So this is the same as it was previously. However, because the Mute jammer's range has been increased, it now covers an entire window, resulting in a perfect counter to Fuse, especially if you have castle barricades up. So this is actually confirmed and an improvement for Mute overall here. Mute counters Finka. So if Finka herself is inside the radius of the jammer, she cannot boost herself or her teammates. And if her teammates are in the radius of a jammer but she is not, she can boost herself, but not the teammates that are in the radius of a jammer. Now let's myth bust the tracking operators in the game. We'll start with Jackal. And as you can see, when he steps inside a Mute jammer radius, his gadget is not affected in any way. He can also scan fine in a Mute jammer radius, and he can also track people who are in a Mute jammer radius as well. So that is busted. Jackal is no longer countered by Mute. Next up is Lion, who has a drone that flies above the map, which requires him to send a signal to it to activate it. So if he's in a Mute jammer radius, it will not work. However, if he's outside of that radius and activates his drone, then defenders moving within a jammer radius will be detected. So it's another busted. Mute does not counter Lion. Next up is the annoying Dokkaebi, and of course she is sending a lot of signals around the map. These can be blocked by Mute jammers, either if she is standing on them, or if the defenders are standing in their range, they will not receive a call from Dokkaebi. So that is confirmed. Dokkaebi is still countered by Mute. And the next one is Deamus. So first of all, if he enters a Mute jammer radius, he'll actually get a visual effect, which will let you know you've just entered the radius of a jammer and you're unable to use your ability. If you move out of it, you'll notice that anyone who's in a jammer radius is not able to be pinged by his gadget. So if we eliminate the actual Mute jammer itself and then scan Mute, you can notice that the little helicopter that he has will track Mute until he enters another radius, and then it'll disconnect the tracking and only reacquire once he leaves the jammer radius. So it's confirmed Mute still counters Deamus. And then the final myth of today is that Brava still counters Mute, but just differently. So for example, if you were to hack a Mute jammer and in its radius was a thorn or capcan trap, in the current version of Siege, that would be disabled, but in the new version, they will not be affected at all, but something like a bulletproof camera that requires a signal to go to it will be jammed. But be noted, you no longer get a visual hint that this is actually happening. In the live version of the game right now, you get an effect on those gadgets that are in the jammer, and you can kind of tell, oh, that's disabled. However, with the new version, you can't, just by looking at it, that it's actually been disabled. It no longer has that fuzzy effect on it. And that brings us into the conclusion for this video. So first of all, the changes here are far more significant than I was expecting. These are on the level of a rework, I think. Of course, the gadget hasn't been reworked, but the way it interacts with everything is almost at that level. And then I also think these changes are a little bit of a double-edged sword. So they said that one of the reasons they changed the way Mute jammers interact is that the original version, which was just an EMP effect, was actually confusing some players on some of the interactions, which makes sense. However, I would say the new version, even though the idea is simpler that it just jams now, is actually a little bit more complicated to explain. And I think you've got more chance of confusing a new player with the way this works than previously. But I also have my suspicion here that they're laying the groundwork for a counter hard breach operator who will use EMP style effects with their gadget, and this is a nice way of differentiating Mute from that new operator who may or may not exist in the future. But anyway guys, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.